Okay, while we're sort of setting the scene here, we are all very passionate about disability. We're really passionate about justice, that people really matter. Disabled or not, people really matter. And we want to do the best for people. And often we're quite, I think, defensive about wanting to protect and defend and to work on disability. But I wanted to think of doing something slightly different. I wanted to think about how we can look at what is the contribution of people with disabilities. So do you want to put on the next slide, please? The next slide, you see, there's my vineyard. What is that contribution? But one thing I want to highlight here is we've only got one vineyard and we're all called to be labourers. Okay, we're all in this together is the idea here. So do you want to put the next slide on? The next slide will show us a little sort of route map where we're going to go. I have identified 4 what I call dis-eases. That's clever, isn't it? You think to yourself, a disease, but it's a dis-ease. It's the way a lot of people today feel uneasy, dissatisfied with the way life is. And this disease leads to a sense of hopelessness. I'm going to explain some of that in these 4 diseases. But I think that if we can take insights from living a life of disability, we are going to find little pointers of hope. Okay, and that's why I'm looking for these little pointers of hope. But that is why I think it is so important that we consider catechesis, support for people with disabilities, support in the community, and opportunities for people to grow in holiness, because people with disabilities have got an important contribution to make and an important contribution to evangelization. So if we have the next slide, whenever you have a map, you always have dragons. There be dragons in your map, okay? So what are the dragons that I really am worried about? It's that I don't want to give the perception that it's a kind of them and us thing. And I don't want to give the perception that we're using people. The usual thing is to say you're using people to make yourself better or other people better. Nor do I want to be seen as romanticizing people. Nor do I want to say that it's good to have disabilities for various reasons because we're all growing through that. Those are all the dragons I'm very well aware of. I'm also concerned of overgeneralization, because obviously if you're not speaking specifically of a group of people, then it could become very, very general. So I'm aware of all of those issues. And I'm also aware that today people tend to talk about maybe people in profound disability or autistic people or deaf people or whatever. So we've suddenly got this idea about all disabilities and we're putting it all into one basket. Yes, I know I'm doing that. Let's see what happens. All right, next slide, please. Thank you very much. So this is why it's not a them and us thing, because the underlying issue of all of these diseases is pride, okay? And pride is a temptation for everybody. With or without disability, pride is always the underlying thing. But the kind of pride that I'm looking at here is my sort of self-sufficient, independent pride, my autonomy, my power and control. And obviously, that's going to be more obvious in some lives than others, which is why I can think that we've got some insights from disability that we can use. So next slide, please. And what about hope? So this is how people with disabilities can contribute to a kind of theology of hope. Well, first of all, we need theology to do this as well. But the kind of hope I want here is not some kind of vague optimism. It's a theological hope. So using John Paul II, disability points to deeper truths about dignity and the greatness of the human being. That's the kind of thing I'm looking at. And this theological hope is a hope for the present, not just for some kind of future. So these insights can affect the present. Next slide, please. So this is my very first disease, and this is the disease of loneliness. So the problem, everybody's lonely. Now, people are lonely, and in sort of today's world, loneliness is seen like a weakness or a failure. And when you're strong and self-sufficient, how do you avoid loneliness? Well, by busyness of the day, lots of activities, going out, seeking recognition in your career or whatever else it is. But the problem with this is that eventually, when there's a crisis and you find yourself lonely, it's not going to be addressed by all of this extra activity. And you find this in particular with people who've had very busy lives and maybe they're now widowed. And there comes a point when they can't go out anymore and loneliness kind of crashes in. They can't just get in the car and go off to the shops or something. And that sense of loneliness leads to hopelessness because most people mask that sense of loneliness by all the other stuff that they're doing. So next slide, please. So in the next slide, we'll see what are insights from disability that we can gain. So on my roadmap, I'm having a disease, number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4. Then I'm showing some insights that we can think about. So the insights that disability has is that, well, loneliness is part of human existence. That is sort of existentially the way we are. But possibly the insight from disability is that people know how to accept dependence. Now, this is an interesting thing because you might say, well, they have no choice. They're not consenting to this. But there is an element there of recognizing that we need others, that we need to be in relationship, that we can't solve loneliness just by our own activity and our busyness, that we need a sense of solidarity. And this gradual acceptance often leads people to realize that dependence is actually part of being truly human. And realizing that being dependent and in need of relationships is part of being truly human actually gives us hope. It's not a weakness, not an aberration, it's how we're truly human. And then the next disease I've put here is idolizing autonomy and power. Now, I think this is a particular sort of Western disease. We prize autonomy, we prize control. And you can see this in countries, we have this in the UK, where there's a constant battle against assisted dying, that people will say that if I lose control, if I become dependent, I don't want to live anymore. So all this fueling of assisted dying is not about pain or suffering or anything. It's actually the fear of loss of control, not wanting to be dependent. And in part, there's a problem here because people are conflating, they're sticking together the idea that if I can make choices, I have human dignity. I have no human dignity if I can't make choices. And inevitably, this is going to lead to a sense of hopelessness because there's going to come a point when, you know, your choices are not made for you. But if we go on to the next slide, we can see an insight from disability that reminds us that as a matter of justice, you've got to do something about poor care, discriminatory practice, discriminatory attitudes. That is justice. But we can see that there is a real distinction to be made between being in an undignified situation that should be remedied as a matter of justice, and human dignity that can never be lost. So all the work that you're doing is about the dignity of the human being in vulnerability or in disability or whatever else it is, because we know human dignity can never be lost. But that message has been lost in the world outside, and we need the insights from disability to say, well, actually, the complexity and reality of human life and being human also encompasses vulnerability, fragility, and all of those kind of things that actually make us unique and unrepeatable. Whole new planet, as the patristic fathers used to talk about. That's what we are, a whole new planet that has all of these complexities we've woven into them. So being truly human in strength and weakness is actually a source of hope because we're integrating our weaknesses and our difficulties as well. So next slide, please. Oh, we're on number 3 of 4. This is the disease of the distrust of the heart. No, if you think about it, we don't trust anybody. We don't trust doctors, teachers, priests, certainly don't trust priests. We don't trust the media. If you don't trust anybody, what are you left with? You can only trust yourself. Trust is now becoming a sign of weakness, being taken in, if you like. And that's going to lead to hopelessness because you'll find you've got no one to turn to. You've only got yourself. But what kind of insights can we get from disability? That'll be the next slide, please. There is, now this is where I am concerned about generalizations, but I'm thinking mostly in terms of people with learning disabilities, intellectual disabilities. There is a tendency to trust, to be open, to make the first move, often to say sorry. And the phrase often comes to mind that people live by the heart. Now, just to remind you, I'm not romanticizing people. People with intellectual disabilities can also be very manipulative, and they can use the heart as well. But the point here is to say that there's this openness and this trusting and ability to entrust yourself to others is really living by the heart. That is being truly human. And because of that, it's a call to hope. We can do that. So next slide, please. Now, another disease I've been thinking of is this quest for perfection. You see it all the time, that there's a bodily perfection, idolizing in particular the youth, being young, and trying to manipulate how you look as if your body is raw material, and looking into virtual realities because you're looking for that sense of perfection. Now, that's going to inevitably lead to hopelessness because people grow old and they get ill. But the issue is that these normal things about age and illness are seen as weaknesses, as failures, instead of part of being human. So put on the next slide, please. Now, this is where it gets a little bit more tricky, I think, for people with disabilities, because often the body does cause problems. You know, it doesn't do what you want it to do sometimes. And people look at it oddly, which is, I think, one of the talks that you had right at the very beginning. But the insights that disability studies are showing and reminding us is that the body, I am not a problem. But also there's a sort of anthropological thing going on here, because we realize that the body and the soul as a unity is your personal reality. This is you. And then theology reminds us of the importance of the body through incarnation, the incarnation and resurrection of the body. And theology reminds us that God does not make mistakes. He knows what he's doing, and that diversity is part of God's plan. And we know all of that through all the good work that you're doing in disability studies and the lives of people with disabilities themselves. Next slide, please. So a few more insights on perfection. Perfection is not about bodily or even mental perfection. Perfection in theology is about holiness. And here's my quote from John Paul II. For disabled people, as for any other human being, it is not important that they do what others do, but that they do what is truly good for them, increasingly making the most of their talents and responding faithfully to their own human and supernatural vocation. So we do what is truly good for us, but as individuals, as unique individuals. But when we're thinking about holiness, and again, so we don't romanticize people with disabilities, God loves us. You know, he loves us as we are created, and he loves us as his creation, but he doesn't want to leave us there. And this is where we need grace, and also we need all of those things that are going to help us grow, which might be the next slide. I've got a wonderful assistant here. Okay, so how are people with disabilities going to be enabled, if you like, to be a witness to hope? Because you can't do this on your own. Now, one theological sort of locus I'm looking into is the idea about the Anawim. The Anawim in Hebrew are the people who are bowed down. They're the marginalized, the voiceless, people without any earthly power. The idea in the Old Testament and the New Testament here is that these bowed down people are empty, if you like, and they're waiting for God to fill them up, and they trust in God. And after all, as we know, if you are empty, there's more room for God. But we need help. We need help to do this, especially against these diseases, because they come from that seed of pride. And that is why we need to have good catechesis for people with disabilities, good community support, help to live out their vocation, so that they can truly become labourers in the vineyard. And I believe this is the last slide. How's that for timing? We can help people to give hope, because the world is truly in need of hope. Because most people don't realise that they live with those diseases until there's a crisis. And that's where I'm going to end, even before Miguel gave me my 5-minute warning.
Yes.
It was a bit fast because that's the way it is.
Yes. That was excellent. Let me just stop my timer real quick. Okay, so we have I guess 20 minutes for conversation. And that I'm sure y'all were taking notes. I was taking notes, and I was doing some thinking too. As people gather their questions or comments or suggestions, I guess maybe I'll start us off with just pointing out that well, I think one of the strengths and one of the elements I appreciate the most about the project is that it begins with a clear decision to sidestep the frameworks of either ableism or disableism, or pick your disability model that it aims for a theological anthropology that is would be or that's where it's rooted in, one that's accessible, open to everyone. It's one that says, okay, let's look in this particular direction and see like how can this be a lesson and a guide for the whole church, not as a special instance, but as a different picture of a normative claim. I think that's part of the that's one part of the strength of your arguments. Like it's making a normative claim from a particular aspect of consideration. That's what strikes me as one of the sophisticated elements.
But one difficulty always is that you want to position disability as just an aspect of being human and an aspect that gives us some real insights. At the same time, we have to take account of people's struggles and joys as being disabled. And, I don't want to go down the route where the disability no longer matters because it applies to everybody. So how do you sort of keep that tension together that says it's an aspect of who we are, and yet there's something else that's going on here as well?
Yeah. Other folks? If you don't have, like I have a follow-up on that point. So one of the things that occurred to me is that as you were walking through each of the four elements, that there was a certain analogy to the efforts of Father Gustavo Gutierrez in the way he developed the theology of liberation, in particular with in theology of liberation. One of the things he was aiming to do was to draw insights from those who were marginalized, disenfranchised, and oppressed. And this really comes out in his book on Job, Father Gustavo's book on Job, when he maps the kind of the methodology of trying to gain normative insights for the whole of the church from a particular population. And so he's really careful in how he teases it out, right? Because not everyone experiences oppression, is marginalized, as poor, but he is saying, like, there's something here that we can, that the whole church can learn from the experience of this particular group. One thing that I think would make your project along these, if there's an analogy that's useful to you, then make your project a little more, it'd be easier to prosecute. Is you have this the sacrament of the anointing of the sick, and so I'm wondering if to take a vocational vocational line and maybe a virtue ethics line on the anointing of the sick, if you might have a resource and an anchor there that wasn't available in the same way to Father Gustavo in his project, because there's not a sacrament of the poor, but there is a sacrament of those of the sick. And so I'm wondering if you might have something in there to anchor something, because then you have then there's that would be analogous to a certain extent, depending on how you frame it, to the vocation of marriage, the vocation of holy orders, and you have a particular vocation of those who are sick within the church as they bind their suffering to the suffering of Christ and stand as a witness for all of us.
But do we have a difficulty there about some people not considering disability to be the kind that needs a sacrament of the sick? That's the tension.
Right. Yes. Yeah. Especially if you want to if we want to make a distinction, but acknowledge that there's one thing to be ill, impaired or infirm in the post-lapsarian sense, and there's just between that and the diversity in the spectrum of bodies that is pre-lapsarian, that's normative for the human being. We come in big and small, strong and not so strong, typical and not so typical. That's at least with Augustine and Aquinas, that's the breadth you get, right? So you would have to probably make that distinction clear. And so so I also think you're right then that lack of normativity there'd be a point where it wouldn't work with the sacrament of anointing the sick. Okay, I see a hand. Talithia.
Yep. It's actually Talitha with no I. Don't worry. Thank you, Pia, for all these insights. I was just puzzled at the end, and either I misunderstood, in which case we just let it go. But you said that it is important for people with disabilities to have community support and to have good catechesis. And I was thinking that you were just saying that all these insights are valuable for each and every one, for all Christians. And so it's not just for catechesis for people with disabilities. I suppose that your insights go for the whole, these insights should nourish all catechesis everywhere, right?
Yes. So what I was saying is that often people don't realize that they can tap into that lived experience that gives these insights, because they've spent a lot of time being told that everything is being done for them or to them or whatever, instead of thinking how they can actually contribute. And a catechesis that makes people with disabilities into the evangelizers, that tells them they've got that contribution. So the catechesis is there to say, you've got a contribution, you've got a vocation, you're not necessarily, all of those kind of things that enable people to take their place and to make their contribution. It's that I'm thinking of, rather than say it's catechesis for everybody.
Yeah.
You know, we forget
capacitating catechesis. Of course, it doesn't exist yet, but that's the word. And then now this may be my French side kicking in, but you talk about dependence. The word here has become interdependence. Is it a word in English too, or do you not use it?
You just froze. I hope it's not me freezing, Talitha.
I think it's her screen.
Yeah. So I am deliberately using dependence because people think interdependence, that's okay, but they don't want to be dependent, because dependent suggests it's the next step down. Well, actually, we're all dependent on lots of things, and that I do not think that there should be that fear or stigma of being dependent, because dependence leads to interdependence. But I think that just talking about interdependence is kind of massaging it and thinking that it's not what it is. So that's why I use dependence.
Okay. Thank you. That were basically my questions.
Other comments or suggestions? Michael.
Just 2 points, Pia. First, let me work backwards. First, your discussion of hope at the end of the presentation and your assertion that the world needs hope right now. I think that is right on point. What I sense, both in my teaching of undergraduates and in my daughters, who are 20, 19, and 19 years old, is a very deep sense of despair about the future. You know, they've grown up in a world where active shooter drills are just a normal part of everyday life in schools, in which they believe that the environment is hopelessly doomed. It's, you know, in the U.S. at least, political discourse has broken down to the point of just being, you know, ridiculous. And so there's this really, I think, ubiquitous sense of despair in that generation, and that might be perhaps why we're seeing such high numbers of mental health problems, anxiety and depression and such. So I think I just want to sort of underscore your assertion there that the world needs hope right now. I think hope is the antidote to despair, and I see so much despair in this young generation. I'm always looking for ways to, you know, to try to present them with hope about the future, and to give them a sense that, that they can still affect change and so forth. So, in as much as your work strives to do that, I think that it really is something that it's very needful at the moment. I also wanted to just talk a bit about your first dis-ease, loneliness. And this is also just to underscore the importance of what you're doing. A few years ago, I spent some time doing research on autism and physician-assisted suicide, primarily in Belgium and the Netherlands, but also a little bit in Switzerland at the time. I think now it's going to become a reality in Canada as well. Across all of the legal domains in which this was happening, there was a common requirement that the person requesting assisted suicide be suffering unbearably. And then, of course, the question is what constitutes unbearable suffering. But what was striking in looking at both the Dutch euthanasia case files for people who had been, as they say, granted access to death on the basis of an autism diagnosis, and in the descriptions by Belgian clinicians who were involved in the euthanasia process, talking about people on the spectrum. What was most striking was that the suffering that they described was universally in terms of loneliness and despair. And so I it's very poignant to me when you say loneliness is part of the human condition. In one way, I very much want to resist that and say, no, it shouldn't be, right? It is, but maybe that's an artifact of sin, etc. Right? I mean, it shouldn't be part of it. But I do recognize the importance of loneliness and how in the cases of individuals who have died on the basis of an autism diagnosis, autonomy really doesn't feature very prominently. It's loneliness and despair. You're absolutely right, though. Across the board, right? In general, the loss of autonomy is the main concern. But for people on the spectrum, it's that loneliness and isolation. And the thing about that is that it is so easily fixed.
Yes.
Right. There are many things about disability or about terminal disease that we can't fix. Right. But loneliness, we should be able to. So that's always it's always been had a very strong impact on me, that the prominence of loneliness as in the descriptions of the kind of suffering that was leading these people to request death.
So if you recognize loneliness as being part of the human condition, and that you recognize that calling out for help is not an issue because it's part of the human condition, that's the insight. And that's what people do. They were more likely to call for help. But the people who are strong and autonomous don't do that until there's a crisis, and then they think it's a weakness and they think it's a failure. And I think that's the sort of distinction there that's
right.
Maybe we can draw on.
Yeah, that makes sense. Seeing it as part of the human condition, as distinct from seeing it as a form of failure. Yes, I see that.
And that's why we need community support as well, so that people can trust themselves and can seek those interdependence.
Other comments, suggestions, or even questions? I have another thought, and it's to highlight or to bring set in relief your aim for a theology of hope. I don't have the texts like immediate before me, and I can't reach them because my bookshelves are a mess. So what comes to mind are those points in Ratzinger's Spesalvi, Benedict XVI's Spesalvi, where he picks up on threads that are important to how that have to do with the connection between the contemporary political social order and the eternal, right? So Ratzinger, I mean, this is like his larger project. It was to frame you know, say, okay, Marx is correct this far, but you know, if you amplify Marx any beyond that, it's not going to be helpful. And Ratzinger's big concern was, you know, when we amplify a small bit of analysis to be a totalizing claim about the nature of the cosmos, et cetera. And so in Spesalvi, if I'm remembering correctly, I mean, those points where he's drawing forward those elements of his body of work, I think there may be some nice grist in there for you to latch onto, especially so you have a magisterial document from the magisterium that's speaking to hope. You have connections from Ratzinger's corpus that would make those how the hope and then counterfeits of hope that are tempting, but are, you know, diminished snapshots of this deeper reality. And then again, I'm just working off the top of my head. It's like I seem to recall that there are places where those threads trace out from Ratzinger's earlier work, Spesalvi, and then on into Caritas and Veritate, which is, you know, that's the bit as a social as a bit of a social encyclical. That's where he makes a lot of those connections. And so I'm wondering then if there might be some elements in there too when it comes to the vocation and ministry of those of the church in the world, especially those who are disenfranchised, poor, oppressed, alienated, abused. I mean, that's part of, I think, Ratzinger's unique take on Catholic social teaching was really bringing that forward, that if there's a vocational thrust. So I know that's kind of like all mishmash. The main takeaway would be like is Ratzinger, Spesalvi, Caritas and Veritate, and then Ratzinger's earlier work, and how he distinguishes between hope and then counterfeits of hope. Other than Pope John Paul II, where are your other links coming either to the tradition or to the from our artifacts from the tradition or the teachings of the church?
Well, there's always going to be an element of the patristics who talk about that sort of uniqueness and individuality of the human being, and also interdependence. We don't often think about that, but actually that's where you do find it, where people are all in this together. So taking it from there, but especially from solidarity, the ideas about solidarity in Catholic social teaching when it comes to human dignity that can never be lost, all of those kind of things that build up into that sort of picture.
It looks like we have a comment from Yana. Yana says, I don't have audio where I'm at right now, just captions, but I want to add to the point about loneliness and the example of Dutch euthanasia. It seems that maybe the question goes toward your point number 2 about conflating ability to make a choice with dignity. We live in cultures that constrain choices, as in the Dutch euthanasia. To what extent is part of the problem that we are formed to believe loneliness or death are the culturally necessary options when it comes to disabilities? In other words, the main choice a person sees is loneliness, and really only loneliness or death. And that is also a false vision of what it means to choose, and especially dangerous when choice is equated with freedom. Thank you for that, Yana. Do you have a comment or response to that, Pia?
I think that, yes, that's a good point. I mean, that's going to the specificity of often what happens, that people are conditioned into thinking that they're better off dead. But also people who don't make choices, that is what clinicians often think. Death is in your best interests. We have that debate here in England. We don't even have the assisted dying going through. So yes, I think that is a problem. That's why people need that support and that formation.
Okay. We have time for one more quick comment. Okay, well, hopefully you all took notes, and I'm sure Pia would appreciate direct emails if anyone has insights that weren't quite ready for prime time. Let's go ahead and move on. Thank you very much, Pia. We'll give you the applause. Now I'll introduce Dr. Michael Waddell from St. Mary's College in Indiana. Michael.
So we have St. Mary's University, Twickenham, and St. Mary's College of Notre Dame, Indiana, correct? I'm going to share my screen with you, and Well, let's just do this. It's going to look a little bit wonky for just a moment. And then I'm going to pull up my PowerPoint slides, and then all should be well. Oh, I see what happened. My PowerPoint slides closed out. Okay, very good. Can you see the slide?
Yes.
Yes, good, wonderful. So I'm hitting the timer, Miguel. Brevity is not my strong suit, and especially when I'm speaking without a script. So I'm going to try to stay fairly close to the materials that I sent you in advance in order to be respectful of everyone's time. As I was mentioning to Julia before the session began too, this is a paper I've been working on for some time, and I'm presenting it today in a different. I'm presenting the meaningful bits and pieces of it in a different order in the interest of time, and so I'm interested to see whether that different order has a deleterious effect on the narrative or not. But let me just say, by way of introduction, to sort of contextualize the paper. Certainly in the U.S., and I don't think it's unique to the U.S., identity politics has become not only something that people are paying a great deal of attention to, but I would say a source of great divisiveness. It's often making it more difficult for people to have dialogue across difference than it is facilitating that dialogue. And in the autism community, the way that has played out has been primarily in terms of autistic identity and its implications for whether or not we should be seeking a cure for autism. In a more theological note, we could also talk about this in terms of whether autism is something that would continue to exist in the resurrection of the body. And I have a paper on that for people who are interested in it. But here, we're contextualizing it a little bit more in the secular mode. And it really is discussion about whether we should be investing the resources that we're investing, which are quite significant in basic science, looking for a cure and so forth. Now, for many years, it was essentially just a shouting match within the autism community. And so on one hand, you had people who see autism as a disability, who thought quite naturally we should be wanting to look for ways to alleviate the impairments that are associated with autism, impairments in the areas of social communication and relationship and so forth. And those often were parents rather than individuals on the spectrum. And in many cases, they were parents of people whose autism was, we might say, more profound or severe, rather than the so-called high-functioning autism. And then on the other side of the shouting match, we had a growing community of autistic self-advocates, for the most part, who wanted to argue that autism is really an identity, not a disability. It's just one among the many different ways of being human, and that therefore to seek something like a cure is something tantamount to genocide, and that's a word that actually is used sometimes in these debates. Now, in the last 5 years or so, it's become more than just a shouting match. The divide, the debate has sort of crystallized in a couple of concrete measures. The first of which was the formation of the National Council on Severe Autism in the United States. This is a group that was formed primarily by parents of individuals who have severe autism, who thought that the rhetoric of autism being a difference rather than a disability was jeopardizing the services that their children needed in order to navigate life. And then this is really more of an international effort, and it had its epicenter in the UK, but really it was an international effort. There was a Lancet Commission a couple of years ago that recommended the development of a new diagnosis called profound autism. And both of these initiatives, the new diagnosis, profound autism, and the National Council on Severe Autism, were really meant to sort of drive a wedge into the middle of the autism spectrum, which we've been talking about since the 1990s. The idea that there's sort of autism is sort of a singular kind of entity, but it can be, more or less severe in different ways. That spectrum approach to autism is now being attacked. What I want to talk about in this paper is really two different ways to responding to this debate about autism identity. And I want to ground them in two different texts, one of which is more famous than the other. And in each of those texts, I think, suggest a kind of metaphysical understanding of autistic identity that we can dig into. And then I want to argue that the second of those metaphysical approaches, which sees autistic identity not primarily as a function of having a function of individuation, but rather a function of relationality, that I think that's actually the way it's best for us to understand autistic identity and then move forward from there. So let me begin with the first of these two texts. And so this text actually it's the published version of a talk that an autistic self-advocate named Jim Sinclair was one of the first high-profile autistic self-advocates. It was a talk that he gave at a I think it was an Autism Society meeting in Canada, if I remember right. But it made such a splash that it was published. And this was actually just to situate it historically, this talk was actually given about a year after the event that's reported in the other text that I'm going to talk about. So I'm actually beginning with the more recent text and sort of drilling down genealogically, if you will. So in the sorry, that is not working. There we go. So the first text that I've shared with you on the handout that we provided is from Jim Sinclair's talk, "Don't Mourn for Us," and it's probably the most famous text associated with the autistic identity movement. And what's on the screen there is an abbreviated version. I'm going to give you a slightly longer reading. Sinclair says, "Autism is not an appendage. Autism isn't something a person has or a shell that a person is trapped inside. There's no normal child hidden behind autism. Autism is a way of being. It is pervasive. It colors every experience, every sensation, perception, thought, emotion, and encounter, every aspect of existence. It's not possible to separate the autism from the person. And if it were possible, the person you'd have left would not be the same person you started with. This is important, so take a moment to consider it. Autism is a way of being. It is not possible to separate the person from the autism. And therefore, when parents say, 'I wish my child did not have autism,' what they're really saying is, 'I wish the autistic child I have did not exist, and I had a different non-autistic child instead.'" Read that again. This is what we hear when you mourn over our existence. This is what we hear when you pray for a cure. This is what we know when you tell us of your fondest hopes and dreams for us, that your greatest wish is that one day we will cease to be, and strangers you can love will move in behind our faces.
Wow.
It's hard for me to read through that without getting a little choked up, having two daughters on the spectrum. But you can see why this made such a splash, right? It's a very powerful statement of the notion that autism is sort of intrinsic to the very being of individuals who have it, right? That it forms their very identity. And I think that this is actually the text that people have most often associated with autistic identity. And so when they think about what autistic identity is, this is the way they think about it, right? And what is featured here is the notion that autism is part of what makes the individual to be the individual that she is. It's what makes her to be the unique person that she is. And so to take it away would be to take away her individuality or her personhood, such that she would no longer recognize herself. Now, Father Terence Ehrman, who's a Holy Cross priest at Notre Dame, wrote an article which I think provides a nice way for us to think about this text from a metaphysical perspective. Now, his article was on disability and resurrection identity. Let's see, do I not have that quotation for you? I do not. Okay, so the quotation is on that I'm going to read is on the handout. But so the article is about disability and resurrection identity. So I want to draw two quick distinctions here. Father Ehrman is talking about disability in general, not autism in particular, and he's talking about the resurrection of the body, not a cure in this life. Okay, but those things being said, I think that the approach that he takes to talking about disability in the resurrected body, or to be more precise, as he would understand it, the healing of disability in the resurrected body, I think it maps very nicely onto autistic identity if we understand it through the lens of this Jim Sinclair text. And so I want to share with you just a very short quotation from Father Ehrman's article. He writes that, quote, Thomistic anthropology accounts for numerical identity of the earthly and risen human being through esse, that is the Latin verb to be, right? Formal identity and a weak material identity. The continuity of identity resides primarily in the esse, or the being of the soul. The esse of the soul is the esse of the one living human animal. The body's being depends on the soul, not the soul on the body, because the soul has its own esse. It is subsistent and continues to exist after death, separate from the body or corpse, end of quotation. So what Father Ehrman is doing here is gesturing toward Thomas Aquinas's metaphysics of essence and existence, and I promise not to get too far into the Thomistic weeds about this. Miguel and I might be the only people in the conversation who would care, but very broadly speaking, for Thomas Aquinas, essence is what makes us to be the kind of beings that we are, and existence is what makes us to be the individual members of the species that we belong to. So essence, esse, being, is the individuator of the human being as well as any other individual. And so the technical Latin term that we're talking about here is esse individuatum, the individuated act of being. That is, for Thomas, what distinguishes one numerical human person from another numerical human person. Now, Father Ehrman's contention is that since disability is not part of the esse individuatum, it's some kind of an accident that adheres perhaps in the body or something like that. Curing the disability in the resurrected body will not change the identity of the individual. The esse individuatum will still be the same. You'll still have the same numerical individual that you had before. Now, in response to Father Ehrman, I want to say it's not so much that this metaphysics is incorrect. I happen to agree with Father Ehrman about the metaphysics of individuation in Thomas Aquinas. And I think he's right that the esse individuatum would continue to be the same in the individual, even if he or she were healed of a disability at the time of the resurrection. You can yell at me for that later if you want, but I think that he is right about that. The problem is not that his metaphysics is incorrect. It's that it's not adequate to capture fully what's at stake in the notion of autistic identity. In other words, Father Ehrman is focused on identity as what makes an individual to be the unique individual that she is. And if you were only looking at the passage from Jim Sinclair that I read to you a minute ago, you might think that that's all that autistic identity is. But in fact, autistic identity is something more than just that. And because of that, I think that the metaphysics of esse individuatum is not particularly helpful or fruitful in addressing the problem of autistic identity. So I want to turn now to a second text, one that has received far less attention than Jim Sinclair's talk, and this is it's the historical recounting of an event by Steve Silberman, who wrote a wonderful book called Neurotribes. And he recounts an event that happened in 1992, so 1 year before Jim Sinclair's famous talk about Don't Mourn for Us. It's a long quotation, so bear with me while I read it. In 1992, Donna Williams, who's a very famous autistic self-advocate, from Australia, came to the United States to promote her autobiography, Nobody Nowhere. Like Temple Grandin, she had felt all her life like an anthropologist observing human interactions from a distance, straining to make meaning out of a confusing barrage of jumbled sensory impressions. The book, which began as a private journal, became a bestseller. Taking a few days off from the stress of her book tour, Williams flew to St. Louis to meet Kathy Lissner and Jim Sinclair. None of them had ever spent time with other autistic adults outside the context of a conference, and the experience proved to be a revelation in ways they couldn't have predicted. Viewed from the outside, not all that much happened. They brewed up cups of tea that would still be sitting there hours later, cold on the floor, because
15 minutes?
they'd suddenly forgot what to do with tea or got distracted doing something more interesting. Hardly any food got cooked or eaten, and other routine chores fell by the wayside. They shared the playful private terms they developed to map their subjective experiences, finding a surprising amount of overlap. And they took Sinclair's 3 dogs out for walks. But the most fun thing they did was stimming together. As Williams sat on Lissner's floor in St. Louis, she would arrange glittering objects in pleasing patterns on the floor, gaze at them through a kaleidoscope, and go into ecstasy. Then she would insist that her companions look at them too. Being autistic, Williams wrote, this is Sinclair. Being autistic, I'm not supposed to understand things like this, Sinclair reflected. But to me, that looks suspiciously like a person wanting to share a pleasurable activity with her friends, end of quote. Seeing the thrill that Williams got from the light cans playing off a Coke can, he later sent her a belt covered in red sequins from Kmart as a gift. He realized that the same behaviors that had been viewed for so long as inherently antisocial could become social in a group of autistic adults, particularly if there were no clinicians around to pronounce them pathological. In her next book, Somebody Somewhere, Williams compared her visit to St. Louis to finally coming home. Together, we felt like a lost tribe, she wrote. Normal is to be in the company of one like oneself. We all had a sense of belonging, of being understood, all the things we would not get from others in general, could not get from others in general. It was so sad to leave. For Sinclair, the relaxed environment of their interactions marked his first experience of being in, quote, autistic space, as he put it, end of quotation. Now, I want to suggest that this event is actually something like the historical origin of autistic identity. And when we read this passage, in contrast with the passage from Jim Sinclair's famous talk, what we find is not emphasis on the unique individuality of each human being, but rather the commonality of their experiences as people on the spectrum. And in fact, commonality that gives rise to friendship. So I think that a better way of understanding what's happening in autistic identity when it's inclusive of this dimension of it is to think of it not in terms of esse individuatum, but rather in terms of a metaphysics of relationality. Now, I won't get too far into the technicalities of Thomas's metaphysics of relation, but I do want to simply note that 2 of the types of real relation that he describes include first, similarity, right, likeness, which is what we see evident in the encounter at Kathy Lissner's apartment, and then 2, friendship or love, understood as a relation based on similarity. Okay, and so what I would contend is that rather than understanding autistic identity in terms of esse individuatum, we would do better to think of it as a form of friendship that is based on the similarities among autistic people and their experiences. And now the importance of this friendship, I think, should not be underestimated for some of the very reasons that Pia was talking about before. We have to remember that by definition, autism makes it more difficult for people to have relationships, right, to have social communication with others. And so once they find meaningful friendships, we have to expect those to be especially dear to them, right? So if we're talking about removing their autistic identity, we need to understand that what we're talking about is taking away the similarity that underpins those friendships. And if we want to do that, then we really need to be thinking not only about, you know, the alleviation of impairments that might accompany any cure that's sought, but also how we're going to meet the needs and the lives of people on the spectrum that are currently being met by the friendships that are developed around autistic identity. And let me just finish here by saying, I think here the Catholic tradition might have some special resources to offer. And I believe that, no, I didn't write it on there, but, you know, I'm thinking here in terms of ways of understanding unity in the midst of diversity, such as the passage from 1 Corinthians 12. Also, friendship, right? Learning to see our neighbor, whoever that is, as being similar to ourselves in meaningful ways, right? Loving the neighbor as ourselves. Seeing shared likenesses, not only in our common humanity, but also in our shared baptism, and in our sharing together and being part of the Eucharistic body of Christ, and so forth. And so I'm especially interested in hearing from the theologians in the group any suggestions they might have about ways to develop, you know, those bits and pieces of Catholic teaching or other bits and pieces of Catholic teaching that they think might be relevant to thinking through the idea of friendship, both autistic identity as friendship, and ways that we can develop other forms of friendship, especially within the church, that might meet the needs that are currently met by the friendships constructed around autistic identity. I'll stop there.
Great. Thank you very much, Michael. Okay, we have about just under 15 minutes for conversations, for comments, questions, and suggestions. Well, folks, okay, I see Pia. Pia, go ahead.
I'm a little bit sort of concerned about that appreciation of Aquinas, because in 1 Corinthians, he does a commentary on 1 Corinthians, and he says, "My soul is not me."
Yeah.
And he does a whole piece in the Summa Contra Gentiles that says, unlike Platonism, where souls don't actually belong to anyone, they go anywhere they like, Christian theology has a soul. My soul is my soul because it's adapted to me. So I think there's still a space to talk about in the resurrection. What matters to you actually is still there. What matters to your identity, and that's something Augustine says as well. But I'm intrigued that, you know, it's almost like having an either or. Either you go down the being line or you go down the relationship line, as if you shouldn't have both going on at the same time.
No, I think it's I think that both. Because I think autistic identity is playing more than one role in the discourse, and so I think one metaphysics is better is a better foundation for one function of autistic identity, namely as a unique individuator. The other metaphysics, relationality, which I think is the one that is the piece that has been left out of the discussion so far, and that's why I think it needs to be introduced. But that helps us to understand how autistic identity is not just about what makes, you know, me or the person on the spectrum to be the unique individual that she is, that individual, but also there are relationships that grow out of this. And so we have to understand, you know, when people, I didn't get into this in the paper, but, you know, in the online debates, people can be quite cruel, you know, and, you know, just accuse autistic self-advocates of just being utterly stupid because they think they won't be the same person, you know, after they're cured. And, you know, I mean, apart from being just, you know, demeaning, disrespectful, and unhelpful in all sorts of ways, what they fail to appreciate, I think, is the nature of the relationships that grow out of the embracing of the identity, the autistic identity. And so, you know, if we want to think, you know, sort of as a church about how to respond to this kind of identity politics, I really think the best thing that we can be doing, even though I don't disagree with the with the metaphysics of esse individuatum, I think the best thing we can be doing from a more pastoral perspective is thinking in terms of the relational needs that are met by autistic identity, and how can we, as a faith community, you know, help meet those needs in our own way.
And I did like your last slide about the one unity and the one baptism, all in the image of God. We share, one end as well as one origin. That was a nice way of putting it.
I see Talitha's hand. Talitha.
Yeah,
You're
here you.
muted.
Well,
Sorry.
Talitha gets this sorted out.
Yeah, I've got it. Sorry. Thank you, Michael, for bringing Terence Ehrman's article back to mind. I read it years ago and forgot about it. I have a question on these metaphysics and Aquinas, and probably Miguel is going to be helpful here too. Not everybody and not all moral theologians agree on this reading of Aquinas, and I wonder if there's anything we can say to people like John Berkman in Toronto, for example, who has written last year, and I've just got the article back, but he says that an impairment is, I quote him, is a lack or defect from that which is appropriate to a human being as a member of that species, according to the nature and perfectibility of that species. For example, if I somewhat or fully lack the sense of sight, that is an evil for me. In this context, an evil is a lack or privation of that which is appropriate for me to possess as a member of the human species. And then he goes on and goes to the resurrection body. Well, his reading of Aquinas is absolutely opposed to what you are proposing, what I am proposing too. And can we get to a common site on this?
I actually think that it's not entirely opposed. And if I had you read a draft of my paper, I sort of work out the nuts and bolts on that. The question is, and first of all, let me just say it needs to be said, the kind of evil that is being discussed there is not a moral evil, right? That needs to be said. I think everybody in this conversation probably knows it, but it needs to be said, right? So we're talking about a privation, and so Father Ehrman actually features a discussion of disability as privation as well. Where it becomes tricky then is when we ask the question, well, can a privation be the basis of relationship, right? Because that's what I'm proposing, is that we need to understand autistic identity as relationship. And actually, it turns out that the metaphysics of a privation for Thomistic metaphysics, trying to ground a relation in a privation is sort of a metaphysical no-no. The best that you could get out of that is what Aquinas would call a non-real relation, or a relation of reason. So it's something that we can construe as a relation in our minds, but it's not something out there in reality. Okay, so here's my workaround for that. What I propose is that let's just say, for the sake of argument, that we think of autism or other forms of disability as privations. Could I still propose this relational metaphysics? And my answer is yes, and here's why. I think that what Thomas would call the fundamentum, so the metaphysical foundation of the relation in autistic identity, but we could apply this to disability identity as well. Even if we construe autism or disability as a privation, if we construe autism per se or disability per se as a privation, we can still ground the metaphysical relationship of autistic identity in the act of understanding oneself to be autistic, or understanding oneself to have a disability. And that act of self-understanding is a real act, even if it is a real act of knowledge about something that is not a real thing, that is a privation, right? And so what I actually propose when I get into the metaphysical finer points of the debate is that the foundation, the similarity that provides the metaphysical foundation for autistic identity is not necessarily being autistic per se, but rather understanding oneself to be autistic. And I think that this actually helps us to make sense out of some of the phenomenology of autistic metaphysics. One of the things that's often pointed out is that the people who contend that autism is simply a form of identity rather than a disability are often people who are quote unquote high functioning, right? Um, and that sort of makes sense if what is required to embrace autistic identity is the ability to understand oneself as being autistic. Not every person on the spectrum has the ability to understand herself as being autistic. Well, let me qualify that, especially for Miguel, but I actually believe they do have the capacity for it. It's just that there's something wrong with the, with the neurological machinery that they can't actualize that capacity, right? But of my two daughters on the spectrum, one understands that she has a diagnosis of autism, and for the other one, that's just not something that will ever be part of her worldview. That's really not something that, well, I shouldn't say that. She's 19 years old, and there's no indication yet that that's ever really something that she'll be able to understand about herself. Well, only one of those daughters embraces the notion of autistic identity, right?
Michael, just two quick things. So Father Terry and I were spending quite a lot of time together when he wrote that article, and so the place where you push back, I think, is a good place to push back on him. And then I'm happy that Talitha brought in Berkman's that particular essay from John Berkman. Anyways, this is just a flag of future. Let's Michael and I, let's you and I get on a different call to talk about this, because there's some nuances here. But I've developed. It's coming on the Thomist on disability, deification, and beatitude, where these questions are teased out. Okay, so pin for a future conversation. When it comes to metaphysics of relations, what stuck out to me was similarity as relationship, similitude, and then friendship, love, affection. That maps identically to way St. Thomas talks about the virtue mercy and the experience of the other. And so you actually have a ground, although I don't think you entirely need it to the degree you're saying, but still there are grounds to talk about a metaphysics of a relation that's based on a privation or a lack on Aquinas's terms. And it's through the virtue mercy. And it's mercy construed as pity is not what Aquinas is doing. But mercy understood as a particular kind of relation that extends from the love of God, that the charity, as we participate in the charity of the Creator, and as we image the Creator, we enter into relationship with others. I think you can get it there on Aquinas's terms. I don't know if that's the kind of move you were thinking, but I think it adds a thickness to it, because it puts it right in the life of faith and of the church. We have looks like we have,
just real quick, Miguel, just to make sure we're on the same page. Misericordia, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and it's in like an article too that he does it in his Tertiary Pars 33 too, something like that.
And if either Miguel or Talitha could give me that reference to the Berkman article, I don't know that article, and so I'd be pleased to receive it.
Other comments or suggestions or ideas?
Can I just say, while folks are thinking to circle back around to something Pia said, Pia, if you read my paper on Aquinas and the resurrection of the disabled body, you'll see that one of the things I point out is that I think that anything that the individual thinks that they will need, right, as part of them in the resurrected body, will be part of their body, right? So I agree with you there. I also like to think, though, that all of us will be, to some extent at least, surprised to find the revelation of our true selves at that time, right? And so for people who have disabilities, that may be part of what is surprising to them. But I think all of us should expect, at least a little bit of a chuckle in the resurrection, right?
Any other comments or questions? Okay, this was our whirlwind, second whirlwind conversation. Everyone did great, so let's give Michael the NCPD applause. So 3 quick things. Of course, send any comments, suggestions, or ideas directly to Pia and Michael, and I know they'll appreciate them as they come. Their email addresses are in the chat box. The organizers and will stay after for in the Zoom room just for a while. And then don't forget, make sure it's in your calendars. Our next meeting is December 1st. So if anyone would like, so we are officially finished in terms of time, but now we have, so we'll say goodbye if you need to go. But if anyone would like to hang out and chat a little bit more, I'll probably first hand off the, so I'll just say, any questions about logistics, protocols to Charlene or Julia. Does anyone have any of those on the table that they'd like to send their way?
Miguel?
Yes.
I have a question. I was going to write you an email, or maybe I did. I can't remember now. Anyway, there is in April in Rome, the Pontifical Council on Social Sciences is doing a plenary session on. Did I write about it or not?
You did.
Is anybody going? Okay, sorry. Is anybody going there? Is anybody of us in touch with them?
It looked very interesting. I looked at their website after you mentioned it, Talika, and it looked really fascinating. So if there was a way for us to liaise with them somehow, that would be wonderful.
Okay, but nobody here is in touch with them. I've tried to write to them, but they didn't reply, and I don't know who's on this council. So
you can find the members of the relevant Pontifical Academy on their website. Paulo Carozzi from Notre Dame was on there. He's a person I've been introduced to before, but I don't really know him well. But I could try to reach out to him to see whether we could find inroads there. I don't know whether anyone else knows anyone who's on the council.
I have a suspicion that might be run through the De Nicola, the Center for Ethics and Culture. And NCPD has a relationship with De Nicola, so maybe we can ferret out that.
I think it's the Pontifical Academy for Social Science, Miguel.
No. I think the Paulo's connection might be through the De Nicola Center for Ethics and Culture by way of Carter. I'm not certain about that. I think that's that might be the.
That's the context through which I know Paulo. That is for sure.
Anyway, it would be interesting to get in touch with them.
Yeah.